we will
No, not from there.
not lose where the video goes.
Yeah. So first off, I want to just, here, let me make it so that I can see everybody also. I want to make this a little more freeform. So if you guys have any sort of questions, if whatever, jump right in, interrupt. The other thing I want to do is I'll switch over to my other computer and we'll do some live demos, and feel free to ask questions in that area too. So trying to take this loose. It doesn't have to be super aggressively structured. If you guys are getting information out of it, or there's specific questions on why we're talking about the importance of particular things, please like jump right in. And this is small enough. You don't have to do the, I don't have enough area to see the like raise hand feature or whatever. So just jump in, interrupt me. So what is photogrammetry? It's the process of taking a bunch of 2D pictures at specific or at differing angles from each other. And then that stack of photos you feed to a computer algorithm, and that computer algorithm has a typo there, 3D models and output. And what you can do with that content is up to your imagination, I suppose. So 3D print, virtual reality, display things online, gather measurements, build 2D or 3D renders. All of these things are kind of options, and there's plenty more. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this, but most car commercials don't actually have a car in them. It's usually a little skeleton with a bunch of balls on it. It's essentially the opposite of a green screen. So it's covered in little trackers, and when they film an area, you then put the render of the car on top of it. The reason they do that is because you can get your lighting absolutely perfect. There's never any scuffs on the car. You can get it to do everything you want exactly how you want it to look in a commercial. A lot of product photography doesn't have a product in it. A lot of this stuff is rendered devices. So you can do the same kind of thing with the output of your photogrammetry and display some of that content. Actually, I think there were a couple of slides. I'm not sure if Ian highlighted this or not, but there are a couple of slides there where he was showing using a 3D render as the output instead of using 2D photography. So how does it actually work, this photogrammetry process? We won't get into all of the crazy math and stuff involved, quite honestly, because I don't know it, and most people don't, because it's hidden behind some sort of black box. The software that does this intentionally doesn't explain how they do it, which is part of what we're after, actually, when we'll talk later about the scat bot and some of that process. But the math behind a lot of this is hidden, so we don't know exactly how much overlap. We don't know exactly what angles are most appropriate. So that's some of the stuff that we're exploring. But generally, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
So do we not know the math because it would take a while to learn, or do we not know the math because it's a trade secret?
Trade secret. Yeah, exactly. Trade secret. And so if you have an object like this, essentially what it's doing is it's finding pixels in a picture that might look similar to another picture. So for example, if it was this picture, you'd see, oh, well, there's this color purple right next to this color black, right next to this color white. And that's a pretty unique combination of colors in this photo. And if we had another photo from a different angle of this same picture, it would go, oh, hey, I recognize that purple, black, white combo in that same shape. And it would say, well, I assume that these 2 points are probably the same because they're fairly unique and they both exist in about the same spot. And so by doing that, it would see here, you've got these objects that it's recognizing, oh, hey, that's an interesting color combination. It's here in my photo, and this interesting color combination is here in my photo. It does these two, it finds the lines, it does the trig and goes, oh, the object must look like that, just based on the trigonometry and how photos must have been. Obviously, I'm super simplifying, and there's a lot of other steps involved in the software and a bunch of stuff that we don't know. But as a result of that, essentially what you're trying to gather here is a bunch of overlapping photos. And the amount of overlap in the different angles that you use all depend on the shape of object and all that good stuff. The other thing is you're really trying to kind of arc along the edge of an object. or orbit around it slightly. You don't really want to be perfectly flat against a thing because you're not giving as many angles of context, but you also don't want to be in a center pivot point and rotating around. So we know these as kind of general rules of thumb, but we're still working on what's the best pattern. So I can get you a good pattern, but I don't know that I can guarantee get you with the best pattern. Also in this scenario, I can't imagine this perfect arc is actually the best pattern because your face here is not actually a perfect arc either. So even this infographic is, they're taking some liberties with this. So here's the output of some different objects that Ian has shot. So you'll notice this duck. I bet you probably don't actually want a perfect circle here. You probably want something oblong. This golf ball, he doesn't have an entire perfect orbit of the thing at every possible increment. It doesn't end up looking something like this. He's just got a couple of different passes and making sure those passes overlap, and making sure that the field of view of this picture up here, kind of gathering over this sort of an angle. You guys can see my mouse, right? Also overlaps with this one, kind of taking that sort of a path there. So he is getting enough data along this section here. So what about the background? So if we look at these objects here, you'll actually see, I mean, they're 2D, but I promise, actually this object here you can see is the same object as this one. We're able to get both the front and the back of that object. And how are we able to do that if it was sitting on some sort of base, right? We can't just have it floating in space. And the way that Ian did that with this one is he made the background useless, essentially. So if you just don't use the background, if there is no data there, then it can't correlate points, right? So this black dot next to that black dot, it's all black dots. There's no data there. So it's not going to try and make that correlation. It's only going to use, oh, hey, this interesting speckle of colors on the actual shell in this scenario. You will notice, though, that there is, even with his nice little felt box with the black backdrop and all that good stuff, there is still some stuff going on down bottom here. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So say in the opposite scenario where you didn't get to take the picture, or the stack that you were given has some junk in it, like this situation down here. Or you did a poor job at acquiring the data, but I mean, hey, you're out in the field, stuff happens, it's life, right? Maybe you didn't have the perfect felt background, or the shape of the area that you were trying to photograph didn't allow for you to set up, your perfect lighting or whatever. So what do we do about that kind of a scenario? So I actually took these photos from a YouTube video of a person doing stop motion photography. So they took a bunch of individual pictures of this donut rotating, and then played it back as a video, and it kind of looked neat, and they were doing it as like a product photography kind of thing. So this was not taken as photogrammetry data. The other thing is, if you remember from Ian's photography class last time, the depth of field on here is nice and artsy and fun, but it's terrible for photogrammetry. The back here is all blurry. There's tons of bokeh. Up here is tons of bokeh. Even the back of the donut itself is not even actually in focus. Your colors are a little much. They're a little pushed. And again, it's a beautiful photo, but it's not the flat, clean kind of content that we're looking for photogrammetry. So what do we do in this scenario? Well, if you just feed this stack in here, you get this disaster of a render as your output. You actually notice this perfectly consistent grid, this cube in the background of these little pink dots. Hopefully Zoom is actually sending that through. That's it, finding all of these cross points. I'm assuming it's finding all of these cross points in the grid of the paper that it's all sitting on here, and correlating those in every single one of those pictures. And so instead of thinking that it's orbiting the donut, it thinks it's this weird flying V thing, and you get this mess. So what would we do in this kind of a scenario? We'd remove the background in some sort of post-processing tool like Photoshop. And I will jump in and show you guys how to do that. It's not particularly difficult. In fact, there's a button that does it for you in some of the newer versions of Photoshop. And you can also automate this process. So if you've got a couple hundred photos of an object, you don't have to go manually do it one by one. And we call this shooting in the void. So the same concept as, if we go back here, removing any data from the background, we're just doing that in Photoshop. And here are a couple of other examples. What's really nice about this is, so I use this like blackish, silverish drop cloth, which has plenty of details of its own, where if you were to feed this in, it would not give you particularly excellent results. Also, I was shooting this outside on my porch in a relatively windy day. So this was even moving, which is not what you want to feed the photogrammetry software. But look at our output. It's better than I could have shot in a studio. And then another fun one we were doing was trash. And so I used a trash bag as our background, just as an extra, play on that whole theme. And our output is quite good. We do have a little bit of issue here in the shadow, and I can show you how we deal with those kinds of things as well. A little cheat here is the orange actually had a double layer of shadow as well. And I'll talk about that when we do the live demo thing. I think we're getting into extra. Yeah, so this is some of the other order stuff. So this is some of the patterning kind of things. We already talked about this a little bit. And again, we don't know the exact pattern, so that's something that we're actually searching for. And really just by doing this by hand, by practicing, what I've found is as long as you've got overlap, you're good. And so really what you're shooting for is you want to take a bunch of photos, but start from a point and make sure that you're always coming from somewhere. So if you're like, oh, I think I need more over in this back section, start from somewhere you already have a bunch of photos from, shoot, and get yourself back there. That way, usually the software has some sort of reference to get the data that you're trying to get. So then we get into all these other things that get involved with this. So it's really not just take a picture and do the output, which has its own set of complications as well. There's all these non-pattern variables. So a bunch of this stuff is what Ian was talking about last time. You need good lighting, you need your good white balance, you need all your camera settings to be useful for photogrammetry, or you need to do a bunch of digital pre-processing like this. So removing that background void kind of scenario, you can kind of cheat it and help the software out by making the sharpening a little more aggressive than reality. So there's all these kinds of things that you can do to give yourself that edge. We'll talk a little more about that in a minute too. And so actually here's a really interesting option down here. So HDR or focus stacking. I think at the end of Ian's stack there, he had an ultra tight macro picture of a bee's eyeball or something like that. Do you guys remember that photo? So because you have to be so tight to the object and your lens is so ridiculously zoomed in, just because how light works, you can only have a tiny section of your photo actually in focus. You can't get that nice deep depth of field when you're doing things like macro photography. So what you could do instead is take a bunch of different photos, all at different focus levels of the same picture, essentially, feed that to yet a new algorithm that combines all of those focus levels so you can have an impossible picture. You have this whole deep depth of field, but at ridiculous macro zoom. Then you feed those output pictures into your photogrammetry stack. And you could theoretically have this infinite depth, ultra high resolution, ultra detailed 3D model of just an impossible thing. The other thing would be HDR. So if you're trying to take a photo of something that has, say if I was in my front yard shooting up under my the overledge of my house at the sun, right? So very, very, very bright sky, trying to wash everything all out, and then very dark under the porch where the shadowing all is. So that would be an impossible picture for your camera to gather. It just doesn't have the dynamic range to get ultra bright and ultra dark in the same photo. So it compromises. Well, what you can do instead is HDR. So essentially, again, you take a bunch of different photos, one real dark, one real bright, and you throw them at a computer and combine all of those to be a useful photo stack, and then you feed that to your photogrammetry options. Then you've got different processing options while you're actually doing the photogrammetry itself. So in the software suite itself, you can do things like, well, how aggressive do you want to be when you're trying to find those matching points and those similar color blobs? How much overlap am I telling the software to assume with my photo stack? Just because I did do 50% overlap with everything doesn't mean I need to tell the software that I did. I could tell it that there wasn't very much at all and it really needs to go try hard. And your output ends up different with the same stack with these different settings in the software. Oh, and then I thought I had added another one here for post-processing, but that's some of the stuff that we were talking about with Photoshop and things like that. So the other really interesting part of all of this is ethics. So one, it depends on what you're doing with that work. So here, let's go all the way back near the beginning on what you can even do with it. So if you're trying to 3D print an object, first off, there's all sorts of other artifacting that happens with the object itself. So your 3D printer is not perfectly accurate. And a lot of times your output is really just to give someone an example of what that object looked like. It's not to have a perfect one-to-one representation of the object necessarily. It's to be able to put something in somebody's hands that they can just look at and get a better understanding of. So you can get away with doing quite a lot of processing to things because the output isn't going to look similar anyways. There's not really a moral dilemma there. In virtual reality, a lot of times the environment itself, I mean, is fake anyways, right? It's generated. And so you are trying to tell a story with your virtual reality. So you might be able to get away with having your textures a little popping harder than they are in real life. Or maybe your virtual reality environment is trying to be as accurate as you possibly can. And so you don't want that, product photography kind of look to things. You want it to be really accurate. So those kinds of situations here, you got to note that by doing some of these things by hand, you are getting rid of any sort of guarantee that the output really is what the input was. And so that's something that we've been playing with on how you can make that guarantee in a world like what you guys are doing, where you're trying to catalog or preserve artifacts as accurately as you possibly can, because that artifact may be damaged or it may change over time. And so gathering it to being as true to life as you possibly can is an interesting implication of all of this stuff. If you're having to go manually clean up an edge because the computer freaked out, well, how are you sure that you cleaned up that edge perfectly, right? Now it's your art that's the output, as opposed to definitely this object. So that's a tricky thing for you guys to think about, and that's part of why we're trying to make this process as clean and concise as possible, so that we can eliminate that from even being necessary. So I'm going to switch over. I'll actually join with my other computer and show a live demo of how to do some of this stuff. Would you guys have any questions on any of this? Or Alex, is there a section that I should have dove into and did not?
No, it's good. Otherwise, it can get a little bit overwhelming. So the whole point,
No
the whole
kidding.
point is to really introduce the students to what you can do in the processing and how important that original data set is. So I just want to keep reiterating that. And as we're moving forward, I think just getting used to understanding what a good data set looks like and how to optimize things, because that'll help the post processing. I'm actually trying to negotiate getting the ferro laser arm for like a month or so in Clark. So having the students learn how to do, maybe some comparative work would be good, but really understanding this is our baseline. This should be our baseline for everything, with both like the macro photography and the photogrammetry, doing, two-dimensional sort of really high quality photography of things like, the coins, versus doing, data sets and photogrammetry of like the larger objects. So it all makes sense. It's all part of the same process.
Cool. So let's go in here. Is it more interesting for you guys to see how to remove a background in Photoshop or using the capturing reality photogrammetry tool first?
You do the Photoshop because that's closer to probably everybody's familiarity.
Cool. Sounds great. Let's, where did I put?
And the void is
Where to
useful.
put it? Yeah, definitely. Actually, Audrey, this process, I think, gets you a bunch of the way towards what you were trying to do with putting your own background behind an object. You could potentially do this with a 2D picture.
Yeah, I'm really interested in learning like more about Photoshop because I don't really know how to use it. But also, can we use Illustrator at all? Slash, do you know?
Yeah, we have the full
Would be
suite in the Clark lab. So
Okay, cool.
Yep.
On the computers there.
Mhm.
Okay,
it's
cool.
all accessible to you. And all the programs that we're talking about today with Capture Reality and Edgesoft, it's all going to be on there.
Okay.
There's also the Digital Scholarship Lab computers. So if you have a need to get to any of these software tools remotely, chat with our group and we can get you in.
Yeah, that's
one of
another
those
thing.
machines.
If you do like a data set capture, I can give you, we'll have SD cards that you can take back to your room, and you can sign on virtually to one of the big sort of supercomputers in the Digital Scholarship Lab and use their processing power and use their programs. So it's a really easy way for you to all work from your own environment.
Totally. So one other thing that you can do here, we'll start with modifying a texture. So the output of, if it will load, the output of your texture of your 3D, your photogrammetry output ends up looking something like this. So it will go and wrap this around your object, and it knows how to do that because it's built some sort of ledger of where all of the triangles exist on the object itself and how those map to this photo. So you can tell that this is that trash object that I had sent in the slide, but where each of these objects actually lives or what part of each one is a little ambiguous. Jalen's got some other fun tools where you can actually tell it where to cut things. So you can define those edges and how it maps from object to a texture like this so that you can do manual painting of different sections. If there's a part that you need to touch up, or if you wanted to do some sort of artwork of your own where you take a model of a thing, but you want to paint different stuff onto it, there are other tools to do things like that. But here, let's hide this window away so I can actually see what I'm doing. So one thing that you do sometimes want to do with these textures, and again, this gets into like, it depends on what you're using it for, but is kind of make sure the colors are nice and looking reasonable, and maybe boosting some of the sharpening, because a lot of times the content that you'll get back out is relatively flat. So if we just double click on that background layer. When it started, it was locked. So now it's a modifiable layer here. And if we go into our adjustments, we can grab our levels. So that's one thing that we want to take a look at. And it's not displaying on the screen, which is a little fun. I don't know why. So there's supposed to be a little graph here, similar to, yeah, okay. So it's great now. The graph here is similar to the histogram that Ian was explaining before, where your bottom section here is your light stuff. So if or is your dark, I guess. So that's your cutoff. So it's going to throw everything out from under here. Right. So now if you take a look at the object, it's all just whites because that's all we left up here, and it's throwing all those darks away. And vice versa. If we pull and we get rid of all of these lights, then we end up with a nice or a very dark object. A very quick way to deal with some of this kind of stuff. A lot of the times when you do your photo shoot, you'll end up having some sort of color swatch so that you can make sure that your photos match each other and they match reality. So you get these little droppers here. So one of them is for a real white one is for a gray and one is for a black. So this will automatically set some of this stuff for you. In this texture photo, because it's just the texture, I don't have a good example of white, but say instead that I was actually taking pictures of a white crumpled paper instead of a brownish, tannish crumpled paper. I could grab this white dropper, grab my most white section, and it will automatically change everything to look like what it should. It will pull those colors in the correct direction. If you don't happen to have a white, you could grab a black, and if there's a black section, you could, pull it towards that. So some of these droppers will help you to automatically do some of those things for you. This is kind of a poor example of one, so let's pull a different different model up here, because it was fairly flat anyways. So let's pull like the donut in. That'll have some fun. Not Capriel. Let's go to just the photo stuff. Let's pull like the same picture we were talking about before. So if we take a look at these levels, these will be a little more exciting. Yeah, so you'll notice there kind of isn't any data up here anyways. It's all super low. So I would kind of squish this down. You get a little more dynamic range. And then down here, there's really no data. So let's kind of pull that up. And usually this ends up looking better. You actually have, you're just crushing the dynamic range. You're throwing away kind of the extra at the end. And only looking at you're giving more resolution in the dynamic range of the brightness, essentially. So instead of going from negative 1,000, these are arbitrary numbers, but instead of going from negative 1,000 to 1,000, right? So you've got a 2,000 increment chunk. You're actually squashing that down and having essentially the same data, but in fewer chunks. So now you've got more individualized resolution. You've got more stuff in there. And Ian can talk better about what that actually is doing behind the scenes as far as how it's storing it in the JPEG or whatever. But throwing away some of those extra chunks at the top and bottom ends up usually giving you a better looking texture. So that's one thing we could do for a level adjustment. The other one that you can do here is, so let's make this a useful layer. And we can go to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. And this will actually let you see the example here. So if I click on it, you see how blurry and stuff, all of, let's see if it'll let me make the screen bigger. Not really, unfortunately. So if you see, oh, I know what we can do. Let's just duplicate this layer here. And then we can quickly swap back and forth. So let's unsharpen mask on this one. And we'll, yeah, sure, call that good. So this is what it originally looked like. If you can see like closely on the sugar and stuff of the donut. And if we poke that, you can see how the sugar really, really pops. I don't know if Zoom actually is able to send enough data for you guys to even see that, but so here's the sharp version and here's the kind of original version, I guess. I don't know if you can even tell because Zoom is going to be doing so much compression. But if you pull a photo up yourself in Photoshop, you can very clearly see it. So some of the settings I like to use for the unsharpened mask, the amount, and so, honestly, this preview window up here is your best friend. So I would go over to a section that is important. So for example, like the sugar section here. And I will kind of move this around a little bit and go, oh man, that's starting to look good. If you go too aggressive with some of this stuff, you start getting almost a shimmer. Stuff gets real aggressive real quick. So you don't want to overdo it with your sharpening. And a lot of times I'll leave my threshold pretty low, the amount a little more in the just a touch over 100% kind of territory. And then kind of play with the radius, because if you go too far, you really get super aggressive edges like this. The shadow is all sharpened and stuff like that. So that's sharpening stuff. Now, if you want to remove the background, there's a nice tool here for you. It's the third or fourth one, the fourth one down here, the quick selection tool. It's shares the same area as Magic Wand. So if you right click on that, it may have already been on Magic Wand. You can select the other device, which is this quick selection tool. And on the quick selection tool, there's basically what you can do is you can click and drag on sections that you care about, and it's automatically kind of popping in and grabbing sections, right? So all I'm doing is clicking and dragging around stuff here. So if I want to grab like the frosting, I'm going to draw kind of a circle around the frosting-ish area. And you'll notice it's automatically bringing the edge there for me, which is kind of nice. So if you've got a particularly pesky object that doesn't want to automatically grab things for you, or if you're doing this manually. So Audrey, if you're doing an individual picture, I would do this by hand. You just get a much better result. And so I would kind of grab around the edge of this donut here and say, I want to grab just the pink section, right? So I'm going to just draw around it ish, and you can be kind of rough. And now it went too far, right? It grabbed everything. So that's kind of how you can do grabbing an object manually. The other way to do that is with the lasso tool. So you can go and grab individual points around each section and draw it all out yourself. But what's really cool is the other mode for this quick selection tool is select subject here. So if you do select subject, it will automatically go figure out what it thinks the subject is. And so all I did was poke that button, and now you can see it has just grabbed pretty well, actually, the donut. So if I go ahead and right click and select the inverse, so I'm grabbing all the background and just hit delete. Sorry, this other layer is still here. Now we've got no background at all. It just did its own thing. Now it's not perfect, right? It grabbed a little section here in the shadow that it probably shouldn't, but honestly, it's good enough. All we're trying to do is get rid of that extra data from the background. The other thing that we can do here is batch this. So that's all fine and dandy, but if you had to do this individually for 200 pictures, you wouldn't be having very much fun. So what we can do here is, if I can find where the menu is, actions. So you can do this with pretty much everything in Photoshop, which is really nice. It's a way that you can build your own macro actions. So essentially you can hit record, go do a thing, hit stop, and then you can play back what you just did on any other photo. So what we're doing here is with my background removal and then black. So I'm actually filling it with black rather than just deleting like that. So I'll duplicate the current layer, exactly what we already did before. I use my quick selection tool, or I tell it to highlight my quick selection tool. I select the subject, so exactly the button that we already did there. I'm actually using the select and mask tool, and the reason I'm doing that after is it will grab an area. It's the same thing, but instead of just getting the marquee tool, it actually grabs and adds a mask layer to that for you. And then I select that mask channel. I make it its own fun layer. Hide the background and fill it. And that's pretty much it. I fill it with black. Oh, and then I save. So what we can do with this now is if we go to File, Automate, Batch, ooh, come on. I can choose whatever my source is. So for example, I already have the trash folder here. And it will go and grab every object or every photo in that folder and automatically output that to a new folder. And the reason it's doing that is because in my actions here, I have it saved to /void. So it's going to a new folder there. You guys able to follow along with this? I don't know if I'm going too fast, too slow.
No, you're good.
Right, just right.
Awesome. Okay,
Makes
perfect.
sense.
So the other fun one here is that we can do with Photoshop is usually you really want to be shooting against a white or black background. And the reason for that is very visible here after we remove our background on our donut. So you can see all this edging here is still bright pink from the background. And you can see all of the sugar is still reflecting all of that pink. And it doesn't look very good. So I wrote another little batch script here called unpink. And so if we go ahead and, what are you doing? Toggle. Yeah. So let's go ahead and run unpink. What do you mean set is not currently available? Okay, so that batch is broken. So I'll have to go figure, that script is broken. But essentially what we're doing here is, man, it's actually been a little while since I've built this one, so I got to go remember what I'm even doing. I think what we were doing there is build a, let's hide this away. If we take the object on this layer here, we select our subject. Okay. There's a blending mode here called hue. And if we just fill, not 3D material drop, where's the just fill button? I guess I can just fill it like this. Oops. Rather than doing this live anyways, which doesn't make sense because I'm kind of guessing if we're being completely honest with you. Essentially what you do is you fill this area with the color that you want the donut to be more like. So in this scenario, it's this orangish brownish of the I don't know what you call that, the bread of the donut. And then you mix it using this hue style mix. And that will pull that pink out for you. Unfortunately, it also changes your yellow frosting to being a more of an orangish kind of hue as well. Where in my scenario, that didn't matter. In your scenario, it might. And so I would also add to that batch a way to select the frosting itself and not include that in the process of making the rest of this more orange. So for this whole process, for either of these, honestly, it doesn't make sense to just go through these on the screen anyways. That's not a great way to remember things. So I'll put together a little tutorial video or a step-by-step instruction thing or link to one that I used to build this kind of stuff so that you guys can just follow along with that. So just knowing that you are able to easily remove the background of an object and you are able to easily change the reflective color on this kind of stuff. What this is really useful for usually is fixing green screen things, especially in people's hair, especially if you're blonde. So if your lighting is not perfect and you have a green screen behind you and that green is bouncing off onto the person and they've got light hair, you'll end up having this like green aura around them. And that doesn't look very realistic when you're trying to Photoshop a new background onto there. So what you can do is take that edging off of the person by doing this same kind of hue process. So that's Photoshop. You can do either pre-processing of your stuff for your stack in an automated batch, or you can process your texture as an output. And there's a billion other features in Photoshop. You can do anything with Photoshop. So we're barely even starting to scrape the surface here. There's lots and lots of stuff that you can do. With capturing reality, this is one of the tools that you might end up using for photogrammetry work. And the way that this is laid out is you end up using it in order. So the tabs go from one to the next to the next. So the first thing that we'll do is add some inputs. So we can either add a folder or just individual inputs. I'm going to add a folder. And let's go ahead and grab the donut background lists folder. And so it's going to go grab my 58 images, and we can see each one of these images by just dragging and pulling them over to these different areas. You can zoom in, you can do whatever you want. So this is my my unphotoshopped thing. So you'll notice in this one, I actually used a transparent background instead of a black background. And for whatever reason, that data still exists. It's just told to be transparent. I don't fully understand this. This seems kind of wild to me that the background is still there, even though if I open this same exact photo in a different photo editor, which let's go do that, my no background. If I open that same exact photo, there is no background, but in capturing reality, that wizardry is still there somehow. I don't really understand how. But if you go and take your actual object, you go over to the image area and you tell it, I want to use a mask. It will automatically, actually, you can see here, kind of gray out the area it's not going to use and only leave the area that it's going to, right? So it added a gray on all of the transparent area. So that's one little gotcha I wanted to make sure you guys know about if trying to use a transparent background instead of a black background. If you use a black background, there's no data there anyway, so it doesn't matter. So the next step in our workflow here, you can either kind of just jump the gun and hit start, and it'll essentially do the whole process for you. But a lot of times that's not really what you want, because as you're chugging through each one of these steps, you might notice something and go, oh, I really want to tweak this thing to get my output to be slightly better. So the next step is align, and you just click align the images. And so what that will do here for you is it should build a mesh. The other thing that you can do is for any of these objects, there's usually a little settings box, and you can make some adjustments down here. So you can tell it how many features I want to look at, what's the most number of features you ever want to consider, how did I take my stack? Was there a lot of overlap? Was there not a lot of overlap? And the way that you can know to adjust some of these is after stuff ends up being aligned, which it's saying finished in 0 seconds, which means something broke. That's the other fun one with capturing reality, is a reasonable methodology of fixing your problem is close the program and reopen the program. I kid you not. There's some weird bugs with the software. I think they're trying to do too much with too little. And sometimes it just does nothing and you have to relaunch it. It's pretty frustrating when you change nothing, reopen it, and ta-da, it works great. Let's go folder, no background. We got our images. Make sure that we're using mask style. Okay. And we will tell you to align. Finished in 0 seconds. Yeah, it's having some sort of issue. So normally when you would align, it would build a mesh for you. This is the curse of a live demo, where it's never going to work the way that we want it to. Let's just grab a different chunk of data instead. How about, what's a good one? The orange was a good one. Oh, that was another one I wanted to show you. So sometimes when you have an object that ends up, yeah, capturing reality is broken. I don't know what to tell you. This is not really going so
broke
smooth.
reality.
I broke reality. You usually literally just click that button. That's the whole process. And it will automatically gather those points. And then I was going to show you all of the control points matching the rays of sight. You can actually grab 2 different objects and see what points it thinks are the same as each other. There's another way that you can go in. I guess I'll just show you the items. I can't really, this is a terrible demo. Show the matches. The other thing that's really useful for this is once you have those matches, you can actually come in and do what's called control points. And so if I want, let's say I'll grab like this one here. Say if I knew that this little speck right here on the donut was the same as, I guess where would that actually be? Somewhere down there. Something here. Then I could click on one and click on the other and tell it myself that there is a manual overlap of those two things. So a lot of times you'll end up with multiple models that it'll dump out over here. And it will not know how to align those other things. A lot of times what happens in those scenarios is you'll end up having taken a bunch of photos of a section and a bunch of photos of another section, and there wasn't enough overlap between those two sections. And so it wasn't able to correlate them to each other. So what you can do is with the control points, manually go in and say, hey, that and that are actually the same thing. And now it knows to flow those together. We're also running out of time. I'm running a little slower than I anticipated. So maybe it's a good thing that this isn't working. But again, how to use capturing reality. Honestly, I would jump on YouTube and check out some other people go through the workflow. But essentially, you'll add your inputs, you align those inputs. Ideally, it will actually grab enough points. If it doesn't, you can jump into the settings where we were talking about and tell it to be a little more aggressive. You then go into reconstruction and you can do a preview style. And what that will do is a very rough estimate, but it's almost instant. It takes seconds, even for a very large photo stack. Then you can jump in and do something like a normal or a high detail, depending on what you want your output to actually be. High detail takes way longer than normal detail, but doesn't really give you all that much better. So almost everything I always use normal detail. And from what I've read on the forums, everybody else does too. Then you will go ahead and texture, which will do a colorize and a texture wrap all for you. Then you can go out here to your export and you can export your model along with your texture. Then maybe you want to pull your texture into Photoshop and give it a little spruce up. You can also modify, if you wanted to change what your texture was, there's another little file there that you can change the name of your texture. It's literally just the file name. And then you gather all that stuff up and you can export it to Sketchfab and be able to show other people your scans. But that is your whole process, is one to the next to the next. So we're basically out of time, but any other questions from anybody? And sorry, the demo here is junk. I think I'm gonna have to uninstall and reinstall Capturing Reality because literally you're supposed to poke that button. That's the whole process.
Sometimes things work, sometimes they don't. We understand.
Yep.
There's a lot of information here. Thank you, Tim, for going through everything in such detail. And I think it'll be useful, for the interns to go back and they can look at the video. And we'll post more resources on the Clark Drive. But this is just to give you an idea to start using some of these resources for processing and post-processing. Questions, anyone? I know it's it's hard to sort of think where to start.
It's also like a data vomit kind of presentation where it's just like, here's all the information. I expect you to understand 100% of it immediately. It's just not realistic. So
Right.
That's why I wanted to preface with, if you've got questions as you're going through this stuff, please jump out, reach out with email. We can go over this. It's not like I didn't learn this overnight. This is a lot of stuff that you have to really dig into. And some of it is an accident. You're like playing with data and you're like, this is impossible. I can't use this. So you do a whole bunch of Googling and you're like, oh, okay, well, I can just cheat it. I'll make it look the way that I want it to look, even though it doesn't actually look that way. And you can get away with certain things. But it depends on what your use case is, because sometimes that's inappropriate and you really needed to take a new photo stack and throw away the data that you originally acquired.